It would mean that we have to understand that those kinds of actions can and do occur in different historical circumstances, that they're not always the same, but that they are to be opposed vocally and insistently wherever and whenever they do occur. It would also mean that no one is exempt by historical fiat of occupying the position of the oppressor or the perpetrator, and this Levi already knew when he considered the actions of the Jewish collaborators. There is no innocence that pertains to Jews or Palestinians as such. There is only an historical demand to produce a political practice and mode of engagement that respects and institutionalizes protection for the precariousness of life. Again, my point is to avoid the cynicism that would say that the Holocaust simply belongs to the past and is now nothing more than a code word for the justification of Israeli aggression. I disagree with that view, and I applaud Zertal and others for refusing that conclusion. We're left, though, with a quandary. Do we say that these political deployments of the Holocaust come at the expense of traumatic memory itself? Do we say that the affect of trauma is kept alive through such displacements and reenactments, such that a specter of permanent victimization is secured for the state of Israel, one that sets in motion rationalizations for permanent war? Is this permanent victimization that subsequently legitimates every possible aggression a way in which the trauma continues to work its force and its claim? Is its permanence an effect of a history that cannot become past, that continues in traumatic form to pervade and structure the present? And if for tactical reasons it makes sense to extend that traumatic past as the horizon for political and military aggression, then it would seem that the trauma uses us at the same time that we use the trauma. So here I'd like to suggest a distinction between extending and reiterating a trauma for its uses in rationalizing aggression and reflecting upon the crimes against humanity that would yield a politics that demands an opposition to racism, to forcible detention, to massacres, and to the illegal seizure of property and the arbitrary arrest and detentions of humans. This latter is surely an ethical and political framework derived, we might say, from the Second World War and the situation of the extermination camps, but it's one that is forced to derive principles from a past for the purposes of living in and negotiating a different present. That transposition or translation can only work if there is an apprehension of the difference between the then and the now, but it cannot work if the then replaces and absorbs the now, since that can only produce a blindness towards and in the present. Indeed, paradoxically, only by allowing the Shoah to become past can we begin to derive those principles of justice and equality, respect for life and property, on the basis of that history. It would be a different way never to forget, because it would not install the past as the present, but it would rather consult the past in order to conduct the comparative and reflective work that would allow us to derive principles of human conduct that would make good on the promise not to reiterate, not to repeat in any way the crimes of that former historical time. So my point then is not to say that we should turn away from the Holocaust as if this past could be forcibly made to stop happening. Life would surely be easier if I could say such a thing, and it could happen. The Holocaust, I want to suggest, is here, as one of the major frameworks that will continue to structure the political field. Is there then a way of working with that trauma that does not simply reiterate and displace it? It doesn't follow that if Jews suffered displacement and annihilation, that the ensuing trauma forms the basis of a claim to certain boundaries or forcible land acquisitions. This did not legitimate the Nakba, and it does not legitimate the expansion of settlements. Indeed, trauma does not in itself legitimate any political claim, except perhaps the claim that conditions that ameliorate trauma are imperative for every conceivable person, regardless of ethnicity, religion, or race. Trauma is not entitlement, though it can lead us to reflect upon how best to institutionalize entitlements such that trauma is ameliorated and foreclosed. In a reactive relation to trauma, it is the trauma that determines us unilaterally, even as we operate within its horizon and by way of its internal logic. The refusal of the present and what we might call the concrete other is the consequence of this kind of hermeticism, which is why waking from trauma is the only way to forestall its endless reiteration. Indeed, in this way, we might say that trauma presents us with a specific responsibility, precisely because it threatens to render us ceaselessly as pure victims who cannot take responsibility for the conditions that we impose upon others. And although trauma cannot be willed away, I think it can, to a certain extent, be worked with to the extent that we can become mindful of the way in which it threatens to absorb the present into the past or reenact the past as the present, and so bypasses the experience of historical distance, the interval needed to reflect upon and consider how best to make a history now in light of such a past. If we can return to the scene in Gaza for a moment, I think we can discern something of the difficulty of this task. Some Israeli Jews compelled to evacuate their homes insisted upon constructing memorials to their lives in Gaza modeled on Holocaust memorials. This is, in Zertal's view, a sanctification of the Holocaust that effaces its reality and produces it as a political cliché. Yet other Jews in Israel and the diaspora clearly understand that the Holocaust taught them to care about social justice, the disenfranchisement of people, random violence, and the dangers of unchecked militarization. The difference between such groups is also over the stakes of nationhood and nationalism, since for some, like Uri Ram in Israel and Omar Barghouti, Palestinian human rights activists, the only way toward a just peace is for both sides to live to the side of their nationalisms, resisting the pathos of nationalism itself. Interestingly, it was Edward Said who claims that in the diasporic idea of Judaism, in his book Freud and the Non-European, that in this idea of a diasporic Judaism, one can find reference to a Judaism that makes alliance with, that seeks and supports solidarity with those in our age who suffer vast population transfers, with refugees, exiles, expatriates, and immigrants. And he further characterizes this diasporic Judaism as the diasporic wandering, unresolved, cosmopolitan consciousness of someone who is both inside and outside his or her community. Said finds there, he finds at the origin of Judaism, which of course he elaborates upon in this book very interestingly, as being inaugurated by Moses, an Egyptian, a non-European, right? And how important it is that Judaism is founded by an Egyptian. And in understanding this, he suggests that at the origin of Judaism there is a mixing with otherness, a question of ethical contact, a question of living in proximity with a non-Jew, since not all Egyptians will be Jews, not all Jews will be Egyptians, so there is the chiasmic link there through the figure of Moses. And he even goes so far as to tell us that living in proximity with the non-Jew is constitutive of what it is to be a Jew. Okay, so you're saying, telling us what Judaism is. The strength of this thought, the non-Jew, as it were, founding us once again. The strength of this thought, he tells us, is that it can be articulated in and speak to other besieged identities as well as a troubling, disabling, destabilizing secular wound. Said asks whether we might continue to think this thought of two peoples, Palestinians and Jews, diasporic living together. And of course, what's interesting here is we tend to think of the diasporic as outside the land of Zion, and what he is suggesting, as others have suggested as well, is that diaspora could become the basis for the land itself. And if it were understood, diaspora as the basis of living together, then the diasporic would also be understood as a way of attaining identity only with and through the other, and that this would become the basis for a certain binationalism. He asks whether this thought can ever aspire to the condition of politics, and he asks this, of course, before the current situation. Can it ever become the not-so-precarious foundation of the land of Jews and Palestinians, of a binational state, in which Israel and Palestine are parts rather than antagonists of each other's history and underlying reality? I would like to query further, is it precisely through a politics of this kind that affirms the irresolution of identity that binationalism becomes thinkable? In 1984, Levi spoke again about Israel after a self-imposed period of censorship, and he embraced this notion of the diaspora for the Jewish people. In response to a questioner, he said, "I've thought about this a great deal. The center is in the diaspora. It is coming back to the diaspora. I would prefer the center of gravity of Judaism to stay outside Israel."